If you were to identify this mode, what mode would it be? Right? D Dorian starts on Dorian. What's unique about Dorian? How's it different from a major or a minor scale? What makes a mode sound like a mode? And how is it different from a scale? So with modes, they have their own unique sequence of whole steps and half steps, right? Whereas with scales, all major scales have the same sequence of whole steps and half steps. That's the difference between a mode and a scale. So you can have a mode of any scale, right? If you start in the second scale degree and make that effectively the tonic of a major scale, that's effectively now a mode. They allowed the use of a B flat and an F sharp. That's just a very quick introduction to this. So if you turn this into a B flat, use one of their exceptions, all of a sudden what type of scale is it? It's natural minor, right? So all of a sudden we have a natural minor scale. So if we go and we look at the other modes, this one's a little bit problematic. We can't change any of the notes in this particular scale. So this one's Dorian. This one here we call Phrygian. Why can't we change any notes in Phrygian, knowing that we can add a B flat or an F sharp? And I'll relate this back to composition towards the end, but we got to start with some basics here. If I add a B flat, what happens to the fifth scale degree? You suddenly have a tritone here, right? So you can't have that diminished fifth because the fifth scale degree is a structural component of the scale. If I add an F sharp here, it doesn't really solve any problems from a structural standpoint. We can change that B to a B flat, right? And then what kind of scale does it become? It becomes major. So far we have a minor scale and a major scale. Could we add an F sharp to the first scale degree? We can, right? If we add a sharp to the first scale degree, it's no longer Lydian. It completely changes the mode. So the only note here we can add is a B flat on the fourth scale degree. So that makes it a major scale. Without the B flat, it's Lydian. Going on to our next scale. This is Mixolydian. There's actually more than 7 modes. There's the hypo modes, but we don't need to get into that because this isn't a course in counterpoint. These are the standard modes that we typically talk about that Henry of Glarus, he actually discovered, and he incorrectly named them because he thought they were the same modes as ancient Greece, but he didn't know that he was actually wrong, but that's another story. So can we add a B flat here, and does it serve any purpose? Is there anything wrong with making the third scale degree a B flat? What do you think? It's not an important structural member. It doesn't affect the first 2 scale steps, which really kind of identifies the mode in some ways. So we actually can use a B flat in Mixolydian. What about F sharp? Yeah, you'd be right. So they did that. Now, what kind of scale is it? If we have the F sharp in there, it's basically melodic minor, right? If we remove the F sharp, what does it become? Yeah, it's closer to the natural minor. So they'd often add both the B flat and the F sharp in Mixolydian, or they would only use the F sharp. That was a little more common. So you're starting to see now that Dorian can be made minor. Phrygian, the third scale degree, right, the mode that starts on third scale degree, is weird. And what do we know about the 3-chord in music? It's also a little bit weird. It can function as a 1-chord or a 5-chord. It really doesn't have one particular role, and we tend to only see it in sequences. So Phrygian's weird, just like our 3-chord is weird. The fourth scale degree Lydian, you can make it major. This one you can make a form of minor, or you can make it major just by adding the F sharp and leaving the B flat off. And our next one, which is really obvious, is Aeolian. So Aeolian is what kind of scale? It's minor. It's natural minor. So you're seeing now how we had all these modes in the 16th and the 18th century. It kind of makes sense that over time they naturally gravitated towards the major and minor scales, because with all the alterations they added with the B flat and the F sharp that they were adding, they could turn these into major or minor scales. And eventually we kind of figured that out and just went with it. I mean, that's kind of like the short version of history here for you. This is one more that was never actually used. I don't know if you can see it all the way down here. It's Locrian. It starts on B, ends on B. There was a problem with Locrian. So what's wrong with Locrian? It's kind of a similar issue to Phrygian, but with Phrygian we couldn't make the B a B flat, because if we did, the first and fifth scale degree, basically the tonic and dominant, would be affected, and it'd no longer be tonic dominant. Here with Locrian, what's the fifth scale degree? It's an F. So we can't make it an F sharp because we're changing the structural member of the scale. We can't make the B a B flat because, again, that's an important part of the scale. That's the tonic. We can't change it. So because Locrian was problematic, they just never used it. Okay, so those are your basic modes. We're going to focus on Dorian right now, and I'm going to teach you first species real quick, second, third, fourth, and then fifth, hopefully if we have time. I kind of want to get through all these because I want to show you how you can actually use species counterpoint in a much looser fashion than what I'm going to teach you for your compositions. When you're writing a composition, you're trying to create harmony, right? Counterpoint does that for you. And all you have to do is be able to count to 8 and understand the difference between a consonance and a dissonance. Even if you want to write dissonant counterpoint, you just invert the rules. So once you learn basic counterpoint, it can apply to a wide array of styles. And that's why this is actually going to be an important topic for you. So there's a few basic rules that we need to keep in mind when we write our melodies. So we're going to look at this Dorian melody. We're going to talk a little bit about it, and we're going to just kind of see how it's constructed. I'm going to play it for you real quick on the piano. It's not a very interesting melody. There's no rhythmic element to it. You would have to add the rhythm later on. So the first thing we notice about this melody is it kind of has a contour, right? It starts on D, goes up to A, and comes back down. This A, it's a single high point. I don't repeat it ever. If I were to repeat that A, it would create this sound like there's a ceiling in the composition, like you're hitting your head against the ceiling. It's less interesting when you constantly come back to that same high point, right? This is a basic concept of melodic construction, but at the same time, that's something that you shouldn't do in counterpoint and in tonal melodies, but it does have an effect, right? What type of effect does it have when you keep coming back to that same high point? I'll play something again where I keep repeating the high point. Just listen and try and determine what effect it has.
This was an issue with my first composition I brought in here. It sounds too repetitive and nasally in the ear.
Yeah, it sounds very repetitive. What else does it do? It feels like the melody isn't going anywhere. It feels like the melody doesn't have direction. So when you learn the principle of counterpoint, you're really not just learning what not to do, you're also learning what you can do. So by knowing that hitting that high point over and over again is disruptive to the melody, if you want a disruptive melody, if you want one that doesn't feel like it goes anywhere, you want to write a piece that's very static, guess what? Keep hitting the high point over and over again. It'll give this sense of tension because we never get a resolution of that high point. And how do you resolve a high point? You go higher, right? Until you actually have one high point. So that's one principle of counterpoint that can really be applied in multiple ways. Typically when we teach you counterpoint though, we only tell you have a single high point, and we don't explain why you should have a single high point and how that can relate to actual composition. There's plenty of Baroque pieces that have the high point repeated over and over again, right? Plenty of classical pieces that do that, and romantic pieces, and even modern pieces. So you have to understand why we have the rule in the first place so that you can break it effectively. So that's the first thing. When we're writing these compositions, what we want to do, these counterpoint compositions, we want to create effective melodic lines that follow standard procedures. And once you learn those standard procedures, then you're more effective at breaking those rules. So you can write melodies that don't follow, kind of the standard rule that we follow for 400 years, okay? So what else do we notice about this melodic line? We have some skips, right? And we have some leaps. It's not all stepwise. What happens if it's all stepwise? It becomes very boring, right? Very predictable. Personally, I think that you can turn that into a great melody, but all that stepwise motion is predictable. It's not great. So what do? We break up the stepwise motion. We don't just go in a straight line to our destination. Destination being that A. Once we get to that A, then you see a lot more stepwise motion because we're trying to relax the line. So all these skips and these leaps, they create tension that needs to be resolved. A skip doesn't feel so much like it needs to resolve down or up, but it needs to go somewhere, right? So if I go from D to F, where do you hear it wanting to resolve to? How many of you hear it up? How many of you hear it wanting to resolve down? Okay, so most of us hear it, looks like all of us hear it wanting to resolve down. So what if I play a major third? How many of you hear it wanting to go up? How many of you hear it wanting to go down? Okay, so it's little things like this that also help them realize there's this difference between the minor mode and kind of a major mode. But you hear a minor third, we tend to want it to resolve down. We hear a major third, we tend to want it to go up, right? So there's certain tendencies, even with individual intervals, like a major and a minor third, that if you go against in your compositions, it's going to be noticeable. And so because that's a noticeable effect, like if you resolve a major third down like this, that stands out. If you resolve it up, it doesn't stand out as being awkward. It actually sounds a little more melodic. So you can use that to your advantage, knowing that a minor third tends to want to come down, major third tends to want to go up, depending on context. That can really affect how your composition progresses. So anytime you have something that goes against what you naturally hear, it's going to stick out in the listener's ear. So what you have to try and do is you have to use those exceptions in a way that make your piece better and not just sound like it's meandering. Because if all I do is just it doesn't flow. We tend to lose track of where the melody is trying to go. So the basic idea here is that your thirds, they don't really have a tendency to resolve up or down, but we might hear a major third is wanting to go up and a minor third is wanting to go down. If we have a leap, it has a different tendency. If I play this leap right here, does it want to keep going up? How many of you hear it wanting to go up? How many of you hear it wanting to go down? Okay, most of us will probably hear it wanting to resolve back down, as opposed to when you resolve back down, it releases the tension, right? If I go up, that G feels like it's just come back from a journey and it's relaxing. If I go up, that feels like the tension is increasing. It doesn't really resolve till it comes back to like So typically in counterpoint, what we try and do, and this isn't necessarily a strict rule, but it should be followed most of the time because it's most natural. If you have a leap, which is anything over a fourth, you want to resolve it down. And the way this works is if I have a leap here from D to G, I need to try and, the rule is you want to try and resolve that leap at least in part. And what that means is I can come down to an F or an E as a resolution, but we prefer the step. So what we're doing is we're trying to fill in the skipped notes. So if I play these examples for you, we've got D up to G, I'm going to come down to F. That's one possible resolution, here's another. Now, it starts to sound awkward if you violate that. I'm going to go from D up to G and then down to C, so I'm going to resolve with a larger leap. It feels awkward, right? Do you hear that? As opposed to this. So we want to try and avoid resolutions that are larger than the initial leap. And that's somewhat true in your own compositions as well. But again, knowing that this feels like more of a resolution when you resolve with a smaller leap or by step, when you know that, then you also know the other side of that rule, which is that if you don't resolve it by step and you resolve with a larger leap, it's going to stand out in your composition. And so if you don't want that, don't do it. Find a way to resolve your leap. If you want it to stand out, like it's a motivic element that you really need to focus on, then you violate this rule. So it's really just about knowing what the rules are and how you can kind of ignore them when necessary. So just as an extreme example, you could have a leap of an octave, right? That means all these are possible resolution notes, as long as you don't hear a really strong dissonance, right? So I'm gonna actually just kind of play some of these. So if we go from an octave down to C, that sounds like a resolution. If I kept going, that feels like tension's building. If I resolve it with a larger leap in the other direction, it sounds awkward. It's starting to sound like it's meandering. So oftentimes when composers tell you your piece sounds like it's meandering, it's because you're doing something weird like this and there's not a particular reason for it. If your entire composition consists of these large leaps that don't resolve somewhat appropriately, then you end up with a bit of a problem, right? It tends to sound disjunct. We tend to lose the focus of what the melody actually is. So you could use any of these resolutions in a modern composition, but one of the things that we try and do in counterpoint is we try and not have any dissonant melodic intervals. So that means if I jump from a D up to the D, I wouldn't want to jump from this D down to the E, because that would be a dissonant interval with the D. Does that make sense? Probably sounds okay to our ears. But that dissonance, it does stand out a little bit and it creates more tension rather than resolution. So we try and avoid things like that. So we're going to start working on this counterpoint in a minute, but there's just one other rule we need to talk about. When we're creating harmony and 16th century style, these are the intervals you can use. You can use an 8, a 5th, a 6th, or a 3rd. The two on top are called perfect intervals. Do we know why they're perfect? Anybody have an idea? Why do we call them perfect? Why don't we just call them major? Why a special rule for perfect intervals? This is actually really important for orchestration, because if you don't understand the basics of the overtone series, and it's a very simple concept, but if you don't understand the basics, then your orchestrations will sound muddy. So if we have a low C down here, we can call that the fundamental. We're not just hearing that low C. We're actually hearing a series of pitches above it, right? We heard this before? Okay. So if I go over and I play this C on the piano, I'm actually hearing the interval an octave above it, a 5th above that, and a 4th above that, and then you hear So if I were to just hold down the C, G, E, C, E, G on top, and I just lightly press them on the piano without making any noise, so the hammers are resting on the strings, and then I play this C, you'll hear those other notes resonate. Hear how it's ringing? So that's actually a compositional device you can use if you have an acoustic piano. Does everybody hear that? If I play a chord that doesn't fit the overtone series, like D, F, A, it fits it, but it's just more removed. It's further up in the overtones. So if I lightly hold down D, F, which is harder to do than it looks, and A, and then I just play this low C, it doesn't resonate as much. It doesn't hold it. C, E, G does. Because it fits the overtones. So it's these basic principles that made them arrive at this concept of the octave and the fifth. Those are perfect. Because right here, it's the first three partials, right? You've got the fundamental, first partial, second partial. So you've got the first three notes of the overtone series. It becomes a little problematic because the next note is a C. So in the 16th century, they thought G to C, a fourth, was dissonant. And it kind of makes sense because if you play a G and a C, the G has its own overtones, right? So what you're hearing is you're hearing G and D against the actual played G and C. So that creates a dissonance, right? So because of that, there's a big debate. Is the perfect fourth a dissonance or a consonance? In the 16th century, they said it was a dissonance. Later, they said, no, it's a consonance. And so in the 18th century, you could suddenly use a fourth. So for what we're going to do, just to kind of keep it standard and teach you some authentic counterpoint while also teaching you how to compose music that doesn't use these strict rules, we're going to say the perfect fourth is considered a dissonance harmonically, but you can use it melodically. So we've got a few different rules here. So our octave and fifth are perfect intervals because they match the overtone series perfectly. All of your sixths and thirds are considered imperfect. Your melodic information, just because we're only concerned with very basic ideas right now, you can use any leaps you want as long as they're not dissonant. So that means you can't have a leap. So I'm going to say avoid the leap of the tritone and seven. There's also one other leap that they didn't want you to use, and I'm just going to kind of play it and see if you can hear where it wants to resolve. If I go from D to B, it's a major six. Where does it want to resolve to? Up, down. How many of you think up? How many of you think down? There isn't really a wrong answer. Where do you hear it resolving down? By step, or do you hear the MVC thing? This. Yeah. Or do you hear wanting to resolve down by step? How many of you hear it resolving by a skip? Yeah. So that's probably because you've heard it that way so many times. But typically the major six, it could go up, it could go down. Down maybe provides more resolution simply because it is a leap, and when you resolve down from a leap, it does resolve it a little bit. But if I change it to a minor six, all of a sudden, that one I think we'll all agree it wants to come down. Did anybody here wanting to go up? Yeah. So we typically hear the minor six very clearly as one to resolve down. So if you ever take 16th century counterpoint and you study the Fuchs version of 16th century counterpoint, they'll say that the major six is not allowed, and with the minor six, you can only use it ascending. So we're going to kind of follow these rules a little bit for the creation of our counterpoint. And this is actually, in some ways, this species is used very rarely in actual composition. So what ends up happening is I teach you these 4 species, and then you combine all of them into what we call 5th species. So you use aspects of 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th to create a melody that really pushes forward, and it creates 2 distinct different lines, right? So one of the ways that we can create 2 distinct lines is that we can use contrary motion. You all know what contrary motion is? It's when they're moving against each other. Similar motion is also a good way to make both lines stand out because they're not moving at the same intervallic distance. Parallel motion, it ends up making it sound, if you use all parallel motion, it makes it sound like you just have one line that's moving, right? So it tends to reduce the independence of the lines. If you have oblique motion, that's good. It does make one voice stay the same while the other moves, so that makes them stand out. But it's also a motion that stops the motion, right? It's a motion that kind of prevents the piece from feeling like it needs to move forward. So there's no rhythm here at all. In an actual composition, you'd want to include rhythm. So right now, we have nothing to push this melody forward except for our intervals. So that means the 8th and the 5th, which are pretty consonant, stable sounding intervals, we want to avoid those as much as possible. So our counterpoint will consist mostly of 6 and 3rds because those create tension that pushes the piece forward. So since we want stability at the beginning and the end only really has 2 options. You can end with a unison or you can end with an octave because you want to make it sound like it's come to a close. So if you're writing first species counterpoint, you'd write your ending in, just make it an octave to reinforce that final note. We call it the final in 16th century counterpoint. I'm probably going to call it a tonic because we're more familiar with that term. And I'm not trying to teach you true 16th century. I'm trying to teach you a technique, okay? So we're just going to call this an octave because it reinforces a tonic. Here we want a cadence. So the way you create a cadence is you use scale degree 7. This is scale degree 1. So right now, we don't have a leading tone. So this is the one chromatic note you're allowed to have other than the B flat. So we're going to make that a C sharp. All of your endings, when your melody is below, your melody is called a cantus firmus. We have the 6 going to an 8. You want to make sure you have the leading tone. All your melodies will have 6 to 8, or you can think of a scale degree 7 going to scale degree 1. And then the typical ending is actually very simple. We use scale degree 1. So you end up with 6, 6, 8 usually. Because most cantus firmi, they're going to go from scale degree 3 down to 2, down to 1. At the very least, they'll have scale degree 2 to 1. 3 sometimes doesn't occur, but it does occur in most of them. So we've already done a big portion of the counterpoint. This is how we're going to end first species. So here, we want to start with a perfect interval when we're writing in 2 parts. With 3 parts, doesn't matter so much. With 3 parts, you can add a 3rd or a 6th as long as you still have the octave. And what does that do? It kind of creates the tonic triad, right? So here, you can start with either perfect interval when the cantus firmus is above. If we were to try and write below, guess which interval you can't use? The octave or the 5th? Which one do you think would be most disruptive? The octave is actually great because it reinforces the mode. If I play a 5th below though, it suddenly sounds like I'm in mixolydian because I have a G. So if I have this D here, and I play the G as a bass note, our tonic now sounds like G. So in order to emphasize the mode, we want a D in the bass. We want to make sure we have that octave. So I'm going to go ahead and show you. You can either start with the 5th or the octave. Your choice largely depends on how the cantus firmus is moving. Here we don't have much movement. It's mostly stepwise and we just have a light skip up. So if we started on an A, we wouldn't be forced to leap right away. If we start on a D though, we could include contrary motion. So if we go from an A, I can't go to a G because now that's dissonant, right? We end up with something like this. You can't do that, right? You want to have a balance of dissonance, right? So the A doesn't allow for contrary motion. You could use oblique motion, but if we use oblique motion, it halts the motion of the line, right? bottom line very clearly. The top line is just staying the same. It's not standing out as its own melody. So since we're trying to create motion that is fluid, you could start with a fifth, but we're not going to. It'd be better to start with an octave and then just use contrary motion. One of the things that we want to avoid is you can move from an octave into a fifth, you can move into an octave, you can move into a fifth. The only rule you have to avoid is you can't have any direct motion into a perfect consonant, so an octave or a fifth. So what is direct motion? So if we moved from an A down to the F, let me just show you what that sounds like. The perfect fifth and the perfect octave, they have a certain clarity of sound, right? It sounds very open. Here's the octave. It sounds almost transparent. Here's your third. It's a minor third. It has more substance to it. Major third, it has more energy. It feels like it wants to move. Here's your major six. That really feels like it wants to move. And here's your minor six. It also feels like it has just a little bit of tension to it. So the fifth doesn't. It sounds very stable. It doesn't need to go anywhere. It's just kind of lazy. It's stable. So if we play what I have, the D and the A in the first measure, and then I move in direct motion into that fifth, it sounds a little bit archaic. It sounds like the motion's been stopped a little bit. So we try and avoid any type of direct motion into a fifth. That's really the only type of motion you can't have in first species. If we do it the opposite way, we get rid of that A, and we use contrary motion, it's not as bad. It sounds like both voices are now moving together, right? Against each other. This is the other version. Do you hear the difference? Here's direct motion. I'm going to play both of them. First, I'll play direct motion. Here's contrary. Do you hear the difference? One of them is smoother, right? The contrary motion is smoother. The direct motion, it really emphasizes the sound of that fifth. And we're trying to de-emphasize stuff right now. And in your compositions, you also want to try and de-emphasize certain harmonies that stick out, unless, again, this is the opposite side of this rule, unless you want to emphasize a particular melody or a particular note. Then you could use direct motion into a fifth or an octave to really create a sense of a new section, create a sense that there's a new motive here that you want people to pay attention to, because the harmony will help draw their attention to it. So we learned this basic rule as a way to know what we can do in our compositions, right? So for the entire middle of the composition, what we want to try and do is use mostly sixes and thirds. You can use octaves and fifths, that's fine, but you want to use them sparingly, because again, they create stagnation in the motion. All right, so if we go here into this third measure, what interval do you want to go to? So if you go to a D, that's an interval of a seventh. And in order to create the most balanced counterpoint right now, we're trying to use only consonant intervals, either perfect or imperfect, preferably imperfect. So, I mean, I agree that the D kind of has a nice motion here, but it conflicts with the E. So that seventh is out. So what else could we do here? Okay, so also, we don't want to go out of the mode. We want to emphasize D, Dorian. And so we don't want to use the C sharp until the very end. The only notes you can use in the middle of the counterpoint are a B flat or an F sharp in certain modes, kind of like I talked about at the beginning. In Dorian, the only accidental you can use is B flat. The ending's always the exception because you need your leading tone. And so if we used a B flat here, that'd be a problem because that'd be a tritone. So if we use a B, because that's parallel fifths, another thing you want to avoid. So parallel fifths have a certain effect too. Mozart uses them, but he uses them in a very particular way in repetitive sections where he's trying to make the horns stand out a little bit. You hear how strong that is? So our first two measures are soft. The motion is very fluid, it's very balanced. Nothing really stands out as being more important. All of a sudden, when you start using parallel fifths, it starts to sound a little bit more powerful than all the other intervals in a way. It sounds awkward, but you can use parallel fifths if you use them in the right way. We often use them in whole tone music and with scales that don't fit well with regular harmony. But for a tonal piece like this, we wouldn't want to use parallel fifths. So make sure you avoid parallel fifths. So that's another thing to put on our little list. No parallel fifths. I think I spelled that wrong. Parallel fifths. Okay, so no parallel fifths. So we can really use a sixth or a third here. We don't want to go back to the octave because now we've got way too many perfect constances. It's just going to sound kind of weak. So I'll play you what that sounds like. It doesn't really flow. Not like the first two measures. So another option is to hold that C over. And that's probably your best option. But you want to try and not use a lot of oblique motion. They generally tell you not to use it more than once in the melody. But are there any other options? We can't go down to a B. We don't really want to go back to the octave. We can't go down to a fifth because that'd be parallel motion. We do have a third, so we could try that. And that should work because it's one of the intervals we're allowed to use. Oops. Again. So that kind of works, right? But what happened there? It's a leap, right? So what do we have to do with that leap? Yep, we have to resolve that. So what's good about this leap? And then that ends up giving us a fifth. What's good about this leap is that the other voice is moving by step. What would be better is if the other voice is moving in contrary motion to it, but sometimes this is our best option, so that's what we're gonna have to go with. So typically you want to make sure that you support your leaps with stepwise motion whenever you can, because that helps to smooth out the leap a little bit. And then if we move up to the fifth, that's actually okay. So now we need to try and figure out how to get into measure 5. We only have 2 more measures to go in per species here. All right, so here, I'm gonna play this. Try and think about what we could use for measure 5. So see that contrary motion into the fifth? Here's your third, it has a lot of energy. It's not so bad because they're moving against each other. The contrary motion softens the sound of the fifth a little bit. Problem is, we are now kind of forced to have a leap here and a leap here, right? And that's not great. So is there anything else we could do other than going into that fifth? We can use a 3, a 6, a 5, or an 8. And we go through all those different options. I'm going to show you each one. So this is an octave. We can't do that because now the leap doesn't resolve with a smaller interval. If we use a 6, okay, that works because we go down a third and, down a fourth and then up a third. That's a smaller resolution. We already tried the fifth. We don't want to do the third because then our leap doesn't resolve. It keeps going down. So I'm going to play all those options. I'm going to play the octave first so you can hear it. So I'm going to start in measure 2. This is the octave. It sounds like the piece just came to a close, right? Those octaves, they really create stagnation. So if I try the 6, that's our next option. That one actually works pretty well. Listen to it again. If we try the 5th, the 5th is actually the best sounding interval, but in order to avoid having a leap into measure 5, the B ends up working out a little better. So we can just go up to a C here, which is a 3rd, and then we need a high point, and we want a high point that's consonant with the starting pitch. And so now we run into a problem, because we can't really have a high point, can we? If I have a G, if I have an E, if I have a D, the D is not the high point, because we already started on the D, so that one's out. If we try a 6, this is dissonant with the starting point. You should try and have, if you're trying to create the most fluid melodies, you want your high point to be consonant with the starting pitch. So the E's out. The G is a problem, even though moving contrary motion into an octave. It's a problem because of the resolution. When you leap back down to the D doesn't get to resolve up. So because of that, we can't have the high point there. So what often happens in the counterpoint is you have to kind of start over, because there are no options. And now we're back to measure 3. So one thing you can do to try and make your life a little easier is you can put in a high point early on. So here would be a good point, maybe make your high point an F. Oh, that's a problem too. It's a problem because we don't want to have too many of the same intervals in a row, and 6 sixes in a row would be a problem. We tend to only want to have 3 of the same interval in a row because we want variety. So if I go straight down, it's 4 sixes. If I try and go into a 5th, it's direct motion into a 5th. If I try and go down into a 3rd, it's a tritone. And then even if I make that a B flat, that skip up, down, up, it's a little bit repetitive. So we're coming into all kinds of issues with this. So we might need to make our high point even earlier. See if we can, because we need some time to resolve the high point, is really what's going on. So this kind of works. We have a 10th, which is the largest interval you're supposed to use. Here's a 5. And now you can have that be. So sometimes you have to go back to fix the problem. And then here we can just have the octave going into the 10th. So now we have something that works. So now if we play this whole thing, it kind of works pretty well. The only thing that is not great is the fact that we have this weird motion. So especially since we're coming to the end of the piece and we want to harmonically slow it down anyway, we could just hold this over into a 6. That'd be your 1 oblique motion. And so now we have a single high point. We changed the directions a little bit, so we got some variety. There's a skip in there. And so this isn't a bad melody, but we might want to keep working on it to make it even better. But this works, and we basically created an entire harmonic skeleton without even thinking about chords, right? So this is what the whole thing sounds like. So it works pretty effectively. So this is first species. It's where you have a 1-to-1 relationship. So in your own compositions, when you are trying to create a one-to-one relationship, you can think a little bit about species counterpoint. You can think how your chords are moving in relation to your melody. When your melody's going down, maybe use contrary motion, maybe use oblique motion, but similar motion isn't so bad either, right? So you can kind of think about these basic concepts in order to create more effective harmonies in your works. Does that kind of make sense? So then, let's say we need to go on to second species here. Let's say you want something a little more adventurous. So what second species does is it adds half notes, offbeats, and they can be dissonant. So we're allowed to use the interval of a second, a seventh, a tritone, really anything. But in second species, they do this thing where they tell you can only have passing motion. They don't want you to use any neighboring motion. And the reason you don't want to use neighboring motion is if I do something like this. I'm going to change our first species counterpoint a little bit. If I do this, it just sounds like oblique motion, like we're temporarily prolonging that D. So that doesn't really work. The melody hasn't gone anywhere. So they tell you to avoid neighboring motion in second species. So what that means, because this is an interval of a seventh, it absolutely has to come down. So that means my only option for this, I really have two, because of the mode. I can use a B or a B flat. Neither option works though, because it takes us into either a fourth or an augmented fourth, and that's a dissonance. So you can't have any dissonance on the downbeat. So with this particular canus firmus, that does not work. I also can't do it by starting on a fifth. If I do this, what's the problem there? We have a fifth, it goes into a sixth. That's actually not a dissonance, so that one's not really, it doesn't have to resolve up. But what's wrong with the motion here? It's direct motion into a fifth. We hear this B going to the C and the D going to the F, so it creates direct motion into a fifth. So we try and include as much dissonance as we can, but we can't always do it. So we're going to go ahead and try and start on the octave. Here you can either use a dissonance or a consonance on the offbeat. If you use a dissonance, then it has to be moving by step. If you use a consonance, you can skip a leap. So what we could do here, we could skip down to like a B, and you could just keep going into an A. The goal is to try and introduce dissonance for the next measure. So once again, we're going to erase this third species solution. Ideally, they always try and take you from first species into second, but you can't generally turn a first species line into second species. It doesn't work too well. I encourage you to try it. Write out a first species line that works, and then try and turn it into second species. You'll find it's actually very difficult. So here we have an augmented fourth. So I'm going to circle it. That's good because we have a dissonance on the offbeat, which means it has to go where? Up or down? Yep, has to use passing motion. So we go up here to a 6. So now, if I want to get to measure 4, is there any way to get to that F? We're going to try and keep the first species solution the same as much as possible. I mean, in this case, we really have two options that won't work. We could do this, but that now is direct motion into a fifth. We could do this. Both of these are dissonances, but this one is a ninth. So we can't have either of those options, so we might as well just keep the first species solution that we already have here. So one thing you could do, because a skip doesn't have to resolve down, is you can use an octave and you can just move by step into a tenth. So if we're trying to get from measure 4 to 5, there isn't really a good way to use passing motion. So I'm going to change measure 5. We still keep our high point, which is good. And then how do I have to resolve into measure 5? What does it have to do? It's really the most important part of second species, so I want to make sure you know. Have to go down. Yep. So if I go down, what happens? End up with a 4th, so I can't do it. I also can't go up. If I go up, again, direct motion into an octave. So once again, I can't use a dissonance here. With second species, the point is to use half notes and include dissonance as much as you can, because that dissonance creates the energy to push it forward. But if you can't, then you just revert to consonances. So maybe we have skip down to a D, which isn't great. And then we have a 3rd here, which allows us to create that passing motion into our 6. So, and then the way you end the counterpoint is you still have 7 and 1. You can use a first species ending for the last 2 measures if you want, or you can turn into second species. So we're going to try and complete this and see which one works best. So here you have a 6. Where would that need to go to? Is there any way to introduce dissonance here? If we go up to the F or the D is a 5th, the F would be a dissonance, it's a 7. It would go up to a G if we had an F, right? So that doesn't work. If we go down, we'd have a C, and that's direct motion into a 5th. So once again, no dissonance. So this is not a great example. And the reason for that is because we really tried to follow the first species solution, and it kind of threw us all off. So we could actually have a 5th here, and then that 5th doesn't have to resolve any particular way. So maybe we'll just take it down to an A, then you can have a B. So it's kind of a crash course in second species. You're just using half notes against the whole notes now. So we have A going to B. We're going to keep the first species ending because it fits with this. If we try and turn this into half notes, we end up with a problem, right? But if you want to do half notes, you could do like a B going to a C sharp. But we'd have to change this B here because we can't use any oblique motion. You want to keep the motion constantly going forward. So if we look at this, all of a sudden, we have a melody that fits with our original melody. And they both stand out. They both stand out because one is moving in whole notes, the other is moving in half notes. So when you have, this is actually a good principle in your compositions. If you have one part that's staying the same and holding a note, make the other part move, because that'll allow that other part to come out. If both parts are moving at the same time, then they don't really come out. They start to blend together, and it can start to sound a little chaotic. So if I were to try and play this, both melodies pretty clearly, and it created harmony that worked. So you can really use this concept of counterpoint in your composition. So we're going to take a little bit of a break from this. I'm going to erase all this if you need this. I'm going to show you real quick a practical application of this. Okay, so let's say I go and I create my melody. It's something like this. Okay, so I have now learned first species and second species. First species is a 1-to-1 relationship. Second species is a 2-to-1 relationship. So that means when I write a background melody, I'm going to go ahead and start in an octave, because we've discovered that in both first species and second species, you really want to start in an octave to emphasize whatever tonality you're dealing with. So from here, I can either write a first species line or a second species line to this quarter note. So I can use 2 eighth notes, or I can use another quarter note. So I kind of look at my options. I'm not worried about the interval distance. These are compound intervals, but that's okay. So if I have an A and I'm going into an E, I could use a G here, because that's an interval of a 6. So this would work so far. Right? But let's say, I don't want to have first species the whole way through because that's kind of stagnant and boring. Maybe I want to try and add second species there. So I have this one motive here. I got these 3 chord notes followed by these 8th notes. Maybe I want to add 8 notes here. So I look to see if there's any way to do it. So right here, if you have a G and you go up to an A, like if I try and add passing motion here, we can kind of check to see if this works. B and D is just a 3rd. And that's a 5th. So that actually would work. So now I've created this secondary line, right? And it sounds effective, right? So now I don't want to have too much motion all the time. I want a nice balance of rhythmic motion that we can remember. So maybe my motive is going to be 8 notes on beat 2 in the bass, 8 notes on beat 4 in the soprano. So for the rest of it, maybe I want to just use, I don't like how this isn't really lined up. All right, but I'm going to try and use first species here. So if I go from the B down to an A, that's effectively another 3rd. Then I have second species right here against a quarter note. So it's again another 2-to-1 relationship. So I use second species rules. This becomes an interval of a 2nd, but I need to figure out a way to resolve it back down to that A. So I have a few options. Maybe I just go down to an F. But now I've used 3 thirds in a row, so the next note I'd use, I'd have to do something different, right? So this is what it ends up sounding like, and I didn't even really think about the melody, I was just thinking about intervals. And it works, right? So all I did was I used the first 2 species to make sure the harmonies work. And then when you go through and you play this, you can start getting more creative with the harmonies. You don't have to use just major and minor thirds. You could introduce other intervals, but the basic idea here is that we can hear 2 independent lines now, and it sounded more or less like it worked. So counterpoint can be really effective for learning how to create harmony in your compositions. And as you've been working on your 2-part compositions, you're going to be doing another one soon. This is something that you could use to help write that second part. So, and this is kind of a rudimentary way of doing this. Again, I'm showing you baseline counterpoint rules that apply to tonal music. So then you can turn a lot of these rules on their head, like you convert them. So let's say you want to write a really modern piece. Have dissonant intervals on the downbeat, follow them by consonants. You can invert the rules. You can do different things, right? But once you learn to write tonal music using these basic guidelines, you'll become more adept at writing other types of music. That's the idea here. So our 3rd species, there's just 2 more. And what I did down there was actually 5th species, because I combined 1st and 2nd. That's what 5th species is. It's a much more florid, ornamented version of 5th species, and they teach you in counterpoint. In counterpoint, you'd still keep the canus firmus, and just the melody would use 5th species, where you combine all the different ones. But that would be kind of a more advanced version. All right, so going on to 3rd species, we want 4 quarter notes for every whole note. So now we can include neighbor tones. So you've got a few different options here. You can use passing tones. You can use neighbor tones. And there are 2 other devices that you can use as well, which I'll get to. You still want to have an interval of a 6 going into an octave at the end. So the way this one works, start on a D. You can also start on an A. You want to try and include dissonance on beat 2 and 4. You can also include it on beat 3. But the basic idea here is that you always resolve a dissonance to a consonant. So if I come down to a 7th as an example, I could go back up to the D, or I could go down to a B. Both would be a resolution into a consonant, so that'd be fine. I'm going to do the D simply to show you how neighboring motion works. If I go from D down to C, back up to D, I now have neighboring motion. So now I want to get into the next measure. We still need to be careful of our octaves. This is downbeat to downbeat octaves, so that's a problem. You want to avoid that. And I also have offbeat to downbeat octaves, so that's a problem too. So I can't go up to the D. What I can do is use some more neighboring motion. We can just come down to the D here. This isn't a great line because we're now revolving around that D. But from a rule standpoint, it works. It doesn't really make a good melody, though. That's what we have so far. But it kind of works. Both lines definitely stand out. Why do they stand out? Really important compositional principle. One line staying the same, other lines moving. That's when you want your secondary melodies to come in. All right, so here, does this work? What do you think? Are my dissonances resolved by step? So you go through, you figure out your intervals. That's your only dissonance. It goes into a third. Some people say the 4th in 16th century counterpoint wasn't actually used on the 3rd beat, but we don't care about that. We can use it because we're just trying to create this ebb and flow between consonants and dissonance. Nobody's going to hear that 3rd beat dissonance, so it's not really that big of a deal. It moves in contrary motion into a 5th. So this actually does work. There could be a little bit of what we call a cross relation or a false relation. They're the same thing, where your F goes to the B. It could be a tritone, but probably not going to hear it because of all the intervening quarter notes. It'd be more of a problem if there was an F on beat 4 in the bass going to a B in the soprano, which wouldn't happen in this species anyway. See that 5th? It just really halts the motion no matter what. It's not wrong, but we're not going to use it because it's such a strong sound. It's just so transparent compared to everything else. It really stands out. So what we're going to try and do is I'm going to try and introduce another technique known as the double neighbor. And from music theory, you should already know what a double neighbor is. So you can have a lower double neighbor that goes down and then up before returning to its original note, or you can have an upper. It doesn't matter. The only thing about the double neighbor that does matter is that you have 2 dissonances on either side of the original consonants. So something like this. So the way the double neighbor actually works, just so you can see, this F is a neighbor to the G, and it has a delayed resolution. It resolves at the end of the measure. This G goes up to the A, that's the dissonance, and it resolves to the G. So it's 2 neighbors that are interspersed. So that's one technique you can use, a double neighbor. And it's kind of a nice little technique for basically using first species with some ornamentation, right? Because that G is just holding all the way through. It's just being prolonged. We can really just keep making this melody move stepwise, but that's boring. We have all stepwise motion here, so it'd be kind of nice to have a leap here or something. So if we go down to the F and leap up, we suddenly create some disjunct motion and we get our high point, right? And then we can just move down into a third. So from a practical standpoint in your compositions, if you make sure you kind of have consonances at the beginning of each measure, if you're trying to write a quasi third species, your composition will work if you use mostly stepwise motion in between, even if you don't count the intervals you're using. Because what we're going to hear is the downbeats mostly. So here we've got 3, 10, 9, 8, and then it goes into a third. So I'm going to try and show you one other technique, the fourth non-chord tone you can use. So we're just going to go up. We're actually going to have a new high point. Okay, this one's called the cambiata. Anybody heard that term? With the cambiata, you have an octave here. It comes down into a dissonance. So that is a requirement of the cambiata. It has to step down into a dissonance. It then has to skip, so the dissonance is left unresolved. It has to skip down into a consonant. So in this case, it's a fifth. You could do this on any consonant note as long as you can step down into a dissonance and then skip down into a consonant. It doesn't have to be the octave. But then what has to happen is we have to resolve this F. So typically, we would use passing motion. So what's really happening here is this F is being prolonged by the D, but it's resolving to the E here. So the E is the resolution. And then it just has to keep going in the same direction by step. So this is an exception to that whole octave downbeat rule, because this cambiata just so thoroughly disrupts the sound of that octave to octave relationship. Some counterpoint instructors will still say you can't do that. So the only way you could have a cambiata is if it moves up to an A. So you don't have that octave to octave relationship. But because we have this G here and this F here, and effectively in second species, it's kind of leaping down to a fourth. It's a sign I didn't tell you. You can disrupt the sound of the octaves if you leap a fourth or more. I know this is a lot of information, that's why I'm recording this for you. So let me just show you what that looks like in second species. In second species, I need to probably further explain what I just said. So we're still using this. We've got a G in the bass. We'll do it this way. Okay, so typically, I gotta make sure my octaves are there. Okay, so we have downbeat to downbeat octaves. In second species, this wouldn't work. If you go down, if you go down to an E, that's not enough of a leap, it's just a skip. It's not enough to disrupt the sound of the octave to octave downbeats. If you go down a fourth or larger, all of a sudden that is enough to make the ear forget the octaves. That's what they say. So we're going to go ahead and play that and see if the ear actually does forget. So here is G going down to an E, so that's just a skip of a third. We kind of do still hear it, right? It sounds very archaic, very harsh. So here's what happens if I skip down to a D, a fourth. It's softer. It's a softer resolution. It does obscure the sound of it a little bit. So now if we do the cambiata, it also obscures the sound of it a little bit, because it's effectively using the same principle from second species. So just if you actually take real counterpoint, some will say you can't have this. Some will say it's obscured by the cambiata. That's a frustrating thing about counterpoint. It's more of an art. There's a lot of guidelines. And typically the way I teach it is if they did it in the 16th century in actual composition, I'm more willing to say it's allowed. And there are examples of this, especially because most counterpoints have 3 parts. And once you add a third part, we hear it even less, because we got that stepwise motion into the octave. So then we just have to end it. So we've got 7, 6, oops, it's a 6, 5, can't go up to the octave there. Okay, we can skip down to a third, 4, 5, 6, and octave. So now we have a complete third species counterpoint. So now what you could do in that previous melody we had is you could use first species, you could use second species where it's a 2-to-1 relationship, or you could add these principles and create 16 notes in that piece, right? So when you do it in actual composition, it's based on how your actual composition is moving, because there's some basic guidelines for that. So if I play this entire counterpoint solution, we basically have harmony that works. We have a nice combination of dissonance followed by consonance. I saw one thing I just wanted to check. No, that's fine. Okay. I thought maybe we had direct motion, but we don't. So the last species, this is really your crash course in counterpoint. This was third species. So now we're going to do one more. And I'm only showing you how to do solutions above. Solutions below are mostly the same. You just got to start with an octave. You can't start with a fifth, because it takes you out of the mode. This is actually my favorite species because it's really easy. And it just uses a lot of suspensions. We all know what a suspension is? So a suspension has 3 parts. Or it's not a suspension. So what are the 3 parts of the suspension? You have a preparation, which is always consonant. So it has to be a consonant interval. That usually holds over the bar line. And then you have a suspension. The suspension part is dissonant, and it's just a tie from the previous measure. And then you have a resolution, which is consonant. So in 2-part counterpoint, there are 2 types of suspensions you can use, the 7 to 6 and the 4 going to 3. There's a third type, which we don't use in 2-part, although again, depending on your counterpoint instructor, although this one I think is just wrong, but depending on your counterpoint instructor, they may allow you to use 9/8. The problem with 9/8 is it sounds too much like direct octaves or parallel octaves. So this wasn't actually used in 2-part, but when you start writing 3 parts or more, you can suddenly use it. So a 9/8 suspension is the only one we can't use. So what this means is if we want to try and include a 7/6 or a 4/3, there's an easy way to do it. You look at the measure where you want the dissonance, and you write in an interval of a 4th, and then you write in an interval of a 7th. What did I do there? Okay, so now I have a 4 here, and I have a 7 right here. So the way these will resolve, just to show you, we'd have a 4, 3, and a 7 going to 6. So the resolution ends up being consonant with the note underneath it. So 4, 3, or 7, 6. So then what you have to do is, since your preparation has to be consonant, you have to hold it over from the previous bar. And this lets you know which options are actually available to you. So if I look at my D to my B, that's an interval of a 6. So I can go ahead and use a 4/3 suspension. That one works. If I look at my 7/6, it's a 9th. I can't do that because my preparation has to be consonant. So that one is out. So I found my one suspension that I can use is a 4 going to 3. So now I've created my first suspension. I just need to start with an octave or a 5th. In this case, I'll just start with a fifth so we get that stepwise motion. So one of the things that makes this species really easy is anytime you have stepwise motion, you can continue the suspension without even thinking about it. You can do it up to 3 times because we still want variety. So here, just to show you, consonant preparation, dissonant suspension, consonant resolution, which becomes a consonant preparation for the next one, a dissonant suspension, consonant resolution, which becomes preparation, suspension, resolution. So we've got all 3 aspects of the suspension for all of those. So at this point, we have to change. We can no longer use 4 species because there's no way to actually create a suspension, a 4-3 or a 7-6, when this is my F, right? So what I do is I can either use a consonant suspension, which I would not normally tell you can do this because it's complicated, but this is just a composition class, so it's a little different. You can go ahead and tie this over to create a consonant suspension. And then here, consonant suspensions don't have to resolve. So I can leap up to anything I want. This is actually what Mozart did in one of his counterpoint solutions. He practiced counterpoint too. It was really the way that composers used to learn how to compose. And so he had a solution that went below the cantus firmus and then above it. And so what ended up happening, oh, I wrote a 5th there. That's a 3rd. What ended up happening was he had a 3rd below and a 3rd above. He just went around it, which is kind of creative. And now I try and set up my next suspension, so I see if I can. Here, I have an interval of a 4th. It goes down to a 3rd. So I can, once again, create another 4-3 suspension. And since we're moving stepwise, I can continue that. And then, as we get to the end here, I have to break my suspension so I can have an ending. So I'm just going to go up to B, use a 2nd species ending. So that's all there is to it for 4 species. You just try and include suspensions as much as possible, and you can use consonant suspensions like this one, in which case they don't have to resolve, or you can use a dissonant one like a 7-6 or a 4-3. The only difference below is that there's only one suspension you can use, and that's a 2-3. And there's a reason for that, which I explained once in a theory class, but it's a little more complicated. Just know that when you're writing below, 2-3 is the only one that actually works. So if I want to write a 2-3 real quick, and just show you how that would look. Let's say this is your cantus firmus, it's suddenly above the counterpoint. I want to find a place where I could include a 2-3. I'm probably going to need a skip. Okay, so we could do one here. So you put your 2 on the downbeat, it resolves down into a 3rd. See that F to G is a 2, and then you just hold it over. As long as it's consonant, you can include a 2-3. So the 2-3s are the only ones you can use below. Okay, so those are all the different types of counterpoint we have. And then in 5th species, all we do is we combine them. So if I want to turn this into 5th species, I might do something like this. Here, I've got sort of a 2-to-1 relationship. Oh, this is actually harder than it looks. So I can kind of use quarter notes there. And then I can switch to 4th species. And then here, I could add some non-chord tones. You do things to kind of embellish the melody.